Good morning, everybody. In this lesson today, we are talking about the beginning of Anglo-Saxon literature. As you can see here, we find words or letters which are which are unknown to most of us, because they belonged to the Anglo-Saxon language, to the Anglo-Saxon written language, but they are no more part of modern and contemporary written language. We can say that the first alphabet that was used by the Celts and also by the Anglo-Saxon was actually called Runic Alphabet, and it was mainly used when they had to write on stones, on metal object, or on the wood. So it was carved, actually, not exactly written. But it gradually disappeared, not all at once, when the Latin alphabet brought by the Romans started to be adopted by all the inhabitants of this country. So you can see here, for example, A, B, C, okay, how they are different from the contemporary, from the modern English, written English language. Poetry and prose for the Anglo-Saxons. We know that the first form of art, of story, was the poem and the prose, and it was introduced in the Anglo-Saxon society, started to appear with an oral transmission. So the bards, you can see here, or the scops, which is the Italian for menestrelli, they used to sing the legends or the myths or the historical events that happened in their country or in not far away countries. So everything was sung, okay, in special occasions where they met, or in the palace or in the castles of the kings, but it was not written, but just transmitted orally from mouth to mouth and from generation to generation. Of course, these poems, these composition, poetical or prose composition, were of course narrated by heart, so they memorized, and they also improvised and creating a kind of historical memory. It means that every transmitted story was then transmitted to the other generations just orally, creating a kind of historical memory. And the first to be interested to with a precise objective of writing down these stories were the Christian scribes. They were mainly monks, and they started to change, to transform what had been the oral tradition into a written one. You can see here, for example, an example of scribe, okay, as well as an example of amanuensis text. Of course, they sometimes added some Christian details to the narration, but they were of fundamental importance because they started to write down and to make possible the collection of the first literary products. We were talking about the Anglo-Saxon literature, but much of these literature, of these Anglo-Saxon literature, is lost. So we don't have any more so many work of art from this period, and all the remaining is contained basically in 4 manuscripts, and one of them is Beowulf manuscript, in which we can find of course the story of the epic poem of Beowulf. This is one of the picture, one of the representation of Beowulf. It is quite not a recent representation. And what is more interesting is this page. This is an original page, and as you can see, it is extremely different and extremely and quite very difficult to understand the language and the Runic language, the Runic alphabet they used at that time. The epic poem, what is the epic poem? Which are the main characteristics? You know that the word epos, is a Greek word, and it actually means oral exposition. Okay, so it is the epic poem is something that was initially transmitted orally. It is normally, we define the epic poem as a long narrative and poetical composition. Why long? It is long because it is normally made of many lines, okay? Normally thousands of lines. It is narrative because there is a story narrated in this poem, so a very complete story from the very beginning, from the first actions of the hero, the presentation of the hero, to the very end of the story, so the defeat or the victory or the death and so on. And it is poetical because it is written in verses, so we find it is just like a poem, but it is very long. The setting is never limited, so the setting is wide, meaning that the story is normally set in a country or in more than one country, and then there is a movement to the battlefield, and then they go back to the country again, or they move somewhere else. Okay, so the passage, the setting is very wide. It is not limited. We never have a single castle or a single place in which the story takes place. The characters are always elevated characters, kings and warriors. Then we have monsters and mythical creatures. And of course, the society described is aristocratic and military, so we have no characters taken from the common people. Or when we find one or two, when we find some, it is because they are useful to the main characters. Okay, they are servants or they are other soldiers. We normally have in all the epic poems, in Beowulf, but also in the other epic poems of the other countries, European countries, we find common scenes. For example, we always have the battle, and we always have banquets or funerals, so the repeating scenes. And these are considered the type scenes just because they are repeated, they are common to all the epic poems. The language is normally very elevated, okay, so elevated and vivid. Elevated because it is not a simple language, a popular language, but we find very difficult words. There are particular complex structures of the sentences, and it is vivid because the scenes are strongly described, because the main aim of the author, of the writer, is that of shocking the reader because of the violence, of the cruelty, and to obtain a complete interest, a complete attention. There are, of course, a lot of literary devices. For example, we find onomatopoeias, alliterations, kennings, rhymes. So all the possible figures of speech or literary devices are present in the epic poem. And we have the main values we find in the epic poems are the typical values that belonged to the Anglo-Saxon society. For example, richness and loyalty, which was really important, courage, strength, and in the epic poem we also find a description of the heroes or the hero or heroes, their deeds, and there is a constant fight between good and evil. This contraposition is typical of all the epic poems.